We hear a ridiculous amount of rhetoric these days about racism. I mean, it's so over the top, it's so extreme. And I gotta say that for an immigrant coming to America, this whole thing is surpassingly strange. It's almost like if I were to go to a country, Rwanda or Somalia, and they tell me, basically the country's divided between the tall people and the short people, and all I hear people talking about are tall people and short people. I would think I arrived in a place that the people had something psychologically wrong with them. Why? Because how can these characteristics bestowed, you may say, by nature, have anything to do with who you are or what you believe or how you feel or what kind of country you have? I mean, there's something fundamentally preposterous about it. And we have from the left, from the progressives, the constant cry that America's full of racism. Now, for a while, I thought to myself, this is just so insane. No, the post office isn't racist, and no, our universities by themselves aren't racist. But then it occurred to me, wait a minute, don't speak so quickly, because there actually is racism in American institutions. Our universities, to a degree, are racist. Why? Because they have racially preferential policies. So if you want to talk about institutional racism, there it is. Now, the point I want to make is that when you really think about it, the progressives are the real racists. And I don't just mean by this, it's the Democratic Party, their history of racism. I'm talking about the progressives now. I'm talking about the left now. Now, what is my proof? And my proof is really quite simple. It is both an observation about something going on today, and there's a historical kind of lineage for it, which I want to draw out. Here's my observation. When you look at the way that progressives and Democrats and the left in general approaches minorities, but specifically blacks, there is an underlying assumption of black inferiority. And that's the core meaning of racism. What does racism mean at its core? It means that I or my group thinks that your group basically is inherently inferior. They can't do it. They can't make it. They've got to be treated as if they can't make it. Now let's look at the way, for example, in that the left treats blacks. And the question you want to think about is this. If the progressives were the true racists, this is obviously an assumption. We can't go into their minds and see what they think. But if they are, in other words, if racism is really on the left, how would they act any differently than they're acting now? That's my point. So let's look at how they're acting now. They're acting now as if blacks are so incapable that they can't go out and get an ID. They oppose voter integrity laws because, blacks can't get IDs. They act as if blacks are so delicate that anything you say that they disagree with or find insensitive isn't just sort of a word, yeah, I don't like it, but a kind of an action. It's a sort of verbal bullet, and everyone has to jump because you can't say that. You can't disturb these fragile egos in this way. The underlying assumption of the left is that blacks can't compete academically with any other group. That if you had meritocratic rules, well, we all know where blacks will end up, at the bottom. We hear from the left that math is too linear, too structured, too logical, and therefore too Eurocentric for blacks and other minorities to be able to do math. What? Excuse me? How can you say this to people around the world, Chinese, Indians, black and brown people, and yellow people who do math and do it very, very well? This is absolutely insane, but it's not insane if there's an underlying hidden assumption of inferiority that is guiding the way you think and the way that you talk. Blacks are unable to keep time. Have you seen this? There's actually critical race theory that says to the effect that the idea of keeping time, of punctuality, of getting things done, of being able to complete a task in a certain amount, in a certain bracket of time, that's racist. Why? Because, well, we all know we can't really colored people's time. Haven't you heard of that one? People in other cultures don't keep time. Blacks can't think logically. Here's another assumption of the left. Blacks can't compete for jobs on the same terms. You need to have preferential treatment. Why? Because if you had meritocratic treatment, let the best man get the job, it's not going to work. The only things that blacks can do, apparently, is keep time in music and run. Or do athletics, because notice in those areas, the left is perfectly happy to have meritocratic rules. No one says, hey, listen, Jews and Asian Americans are greatly underrepresented on the basketball court. We don't hear that. Meritocracy is fine in that domain. So the bottom line of it is that for the left, blacks are treated kind of the way you treat someone in a Special Olympics. You've got to give them special consideration. I mean, I think back to India, where we had a kid in my class who had a kind of mild case of Down syndrome. I think his name was Prakash. And the point is that whenever he did something, there was always ridiculously excessive applause. But the applause was only an indication that people really didn't expect much of him. Oh, that was a sentence from Prakash. How wonderful, Prakash. Keep using sentences. Prakash says, let me go get my shoes. Oh, Prakash is going to get his shoes. This is amazing. Let's all applaud Prakash. Prakash, go get your shoes. What a great job by Prakash. The underlying assumption here is Prakash has got something wrong with him, and therefore every little thing that Prakash does requires excessive solicitousness, requires excessive applause. The expectation, to be honest, is one of inferiority. Now, interestingly, this has an historical pedigree, because if you go back to the days of segregation, it's not widely understood that there were two racist groups in the South. There were the radical racists, and these were the Ku Klux Klan's guys. They were the people who wanted to beat up blacks and hang them from trees and lynch them. But this was only one wing of the Democratic Party. There was another wing of the Democratic Party. Let's remember the South was a one-party state. There was hardly any Republicans with any influence in the South. But the Democrats were divided into two camps. There was the radical racists, but then there were also the Democratic patricians, the kind of ruling class of the South. And I want to read a very telling line about them from Joel Williamson. This is the historian Joel Williamson in his book, The Crucible of Race, published by Stanford University Press. And he's talking about segregation, and he says that the patrician class of the South wanted to figure out a way that blacks and whites could coexist. Of course, they thought blacks were inferior. They shared this assumption with the other Democrats in the South. They agreed with the radical racists about this. But while the radical racists wanted to kill blacks and hang them and destroy them, the patrician class said, let's find a way for these inferior people to coexist with us. And that they came up with the idea of segregation. I'm now quoting him. Far from putting down the self-esteem of black people, says historian Joel Williamson, segregation was designed to preserve and encourage it. In other words, the basic idea was, let's let blacks have their own schools. Let them drink from separate water fountains. This way, they don't get in our way. This way, we don't have to deal with them. But on the other hand, they will be able to develop, in a sense, to the limits of their own, you may say, arrested development. And what I'm getting at here is there was a built-in racist assumption among the Democrats, both the radical racists and the patrician class. All of this, by the way, spelled out in detail in my book, The End of Racism, which gets into this at a level you won't even really believe. But what it tries to excavate is that there is a whole school of, I would call them the condescending racists. These are people who build their policies on inferiority. And what I'm trying to get at is that there's a kind of continuity. The old Democrats of the South who devised segregation, who thought of themselves, in a sense, as moral. They're like, you know what? We've got to help our own little Prakashas to make it in America. We're doing them a favor. We're allowing them to develop to their own capacity. It may be a lesser capacity, but that's okay. And I think there are a lot of Democrats today who feel sort of the same thing. We've got to sort of take care of blacks. Why? Because they obviously can't take care of themselves. America should provide them with a living. Why? Because they can't earn a living. So the point I'm trying to make is that the deep built-in racist assumption that these people are inferior. The left normally doesn't say it. Every now and then it kind of sneaks out. But by and large, it's the hidden assumption that explains not just some, not just a little bit, but all the policies of the contemporary left.